Good morning, everyone. My name is Zaina Al-Shaib. I'm the Deputy Director of Communications at the Middle East Institute. I'd like to welcome you all to this on-the-record briefing session in which we will discuss the geopolitical implications of Israel's Rafah offensive. Israel launched a deepening offensive in Gaza's southernmost city of Rafah, triggering an exodus of nearly 1 million displaced Palestinians. Israel maintains that its military campaign in Rafah is crucial to root out Hamas and destroy the group's capabilities after the October 7 attack. However, following a recent airstrike that resulted in more than 45 civilian deaths, what will the Rafah campaign mean for Israel's international, political, and moral standing? To help us dissect it all, I am delighted to welcome Nathalie Tocci, former Special Advisor to EU High Representatives Federica Mogherini and Josep Borrell, and current Director of the Istituto Affari Internazionali. Brian Katulis, Senior Fellow for U.S. Foreign Policy at the Middle East Institute, and Nimrod Goren, MEI Senior Fellow for Israeli Affairs. Thank you all for joining us this morning. When we get to the Q&A portion, you can use the raise hand function on your screen to ask a question. And if you're called on, we will unmute you, and you can introduce yourself and direct your question to our panelists. Questions can also be submitted in writing via the Q&A chat box on Zoom. I'll go over this again later, but for now, let's get right into it. I'm going to start with Nimrod first. Nimrod, how has the expansion of the Rafah campaign led to new pressures on Israel and new dynamics?
I think much less than what was anticipated. For months we've been hearing about Rafah as the big thing in the Gaza war, but eventually when Israel's operation in Rafah happened, we see that actually coordination with allies works. The Americans were pushing quite significantly against an Israeli major ground operation in Rafah, seemed to be quite satisfied with how Israel is shaping its military offensive. Of course, not with all the mistakes killing many Palestinians, but in terms of the strategy, the military strategy and the actual achievements. With Egypt, there were a lot of very fierce statements about possible consequences, possibly damaging the Camp David Accords, and overall, despite the tensions, again, we see things are quite in line in terms of back-channel coordination and taking into account concerns of Egypt by Israelis. So overall, when we look at the impact on regional standing and international standing of Israel, it goes much beyond Rafah. And Rafah is one point in a longer story, which is the war in Gaza that is taking place for quite some time and taking a toll. Currently, the Tel Aviv University poll showed that 70% of Israelis think that only very few allies in the world stand by Israel, which is largely isolated. Okay, but the question is, how does this differ between different entities? So we see a gap between states, between multilateral institutions, between non-formal or unofficial channels, very big gaps. On the state level, generally speaking, interests are at play. So when there are leaders that are criticizing Israel maybe more than before, those countries in the region and beyond with which Israel has important joint interests, those are still the ones dominating and shaping the relationship. And the steps that are being taken are largely symbolic. So even if we see European countries, and Nathalie will probably speak about it, recognizing a Palestinian state, in practice, what does that mean in terms of the bilateral relations with Israel? Beyond the tensions and the back and forth between the Israeli MFA criticizing them, what does it actually mean? Does it have meaningful for the long run? On the institutional level, we see much more deterioration, whether it's the ICC, the ICJ, resolution coming to the UN Security Council. From an Israeli point of view, these are exaggerated. That's kind of the mainstream thinking. And Israelis are still relying on their international allies, mostly the US and Germany, to get rid of it and take care of this problem. That's the assumption. It could be bypassed. Where we see most of the change happening is in the informal level. And that's where the prophecy of our former Prime Minister, Ehud Barak, who spoke in 2011 about a diplomatic tsunami, which turned into a joke in the Israeli debate ever since. But now it's happening. Israelis are feeling that the ground is shaking and some of our basic interactions within the international space are changing, shifting, not clearly to which extent yet. It already happened before, when Netanyahu and his far-right government took office in late 22, before the war, during those months of judicial overhaul. There were already a lot of slowing down of relations with Arab countries and pushback from liberal democratic allies. But now Israelis are feeling excluded, boycotted, left out of academic circles, of cultural events, maybe in the future of sporting competitions as well. Flights in and out of Israel are becoming much more difficult. We see public protests in universities and beyond in European cities. The sense of safety that an Israeli has when he goes into an international setting, whether as a professional or as a tourist, this is really changing. And this may have long-term effects. Again, not on high-level politics, but on the experience of Israelis working within the international space. And those typically are the Israeli elites. So while the mainstream of the Israeli society is not regularly engaging with the international community, and they have this traditional mindset of the world is against us, Israel being isolated. That's not new. We faced criticism before. The ones that are really feeling the impact are the ones that are generally more opposed to Netanyahu than supportive of it. And then the last question on that is whether this is temporary or whether it will change. And we are at a decisive moment. There is an offer on the table to go for a ceasefire, to release hostages, maybe to end the war. There is broad support in Israel to that, including the ultra-Orthodox party spelling this out today. Only the far right opposes. We still have doubts about how genuine Netanyahu is. But if we enter a process of, first, political change within Israel through early elections, changing the nature of the extreme government, plus a process towards ending the war, how much of this criticism will stick and how much of it will change? So on the public level, those punishing Israel for what it already did in Gaza, that sentiment will change. But those who are critical of Israel because it continues the war and because it has a far-right leadership, when that changes, I think doors will open once again rather quickly for a different sort of relationship between Israel and its international allies.
Thank you, Nimrod. Turning to you, Nathalie, the EU has been increasingly critical of Israel's conduct of the Gaza war and the Rafah invasion. 3 European countries have recognized Palestinian statehood last week, and others are mulling sanctions against Israel. How much impact do you expect this growing pressure to have, and how unified is the European stance?
Well, Zaina, I would start actually with that last thing that you said, how unified are we? Because I think, if there's one word that really encapsulates what the European position has been over Gaza, it is actually division. And I think it's worth reminding everyone that it was not always like this. Right? There was a time in which actually on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, there was, quite significant unity within the EU. If you go back, I just happened to sort of read over council conclusions from 2001, the period between 99 and 2001, 2002. And, there were very detailed paragraphs on which, all member states had signed off, basically kind of delineating what the two-state solution would or should look like. Now, essentially what happened for a number of years before we even get to the 7th of October is that internal consensus started eroding over time. And as it eroded, and as it was obvious for anyone working in the institutions that this was happening, there was quite a convenient, or rather, it was rather convenient to latch on to, in a sense, the Netanyahu narrative of we don't actually need to even think about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which of course, ran up, that was the situation which ran up to the 7th of October. So in a sense, there was a political convenience, basically, that was internal to the EU, which explained why, if, this is a question that has kind of more or less resolved itself, we don't even need to talk about it. And if we don't talk about it, we don't expose those divisions. Then, of course, 7th of October happens, and inevitably you've got to talk about it, and those divisions kind of surface. And what we've been seeing since the 7th of October is the way in which these divisions are playing out on the multiple dimensions of the Gaza war as the Gaza war unfolds. So initially, it was just quote unquote, a division about, ceasefire, no ceasefire, right? Then it became a division about, suspending aid to UNRWA, not suspending aid to UNRWA. Then added onto this, there is the other division that you were pointing to, which is that of recognition. And of course, let us remind everyone that, well, of course, Norway is not an EU member state. Ireland and who was it again? Spain, obviously are. But this adds to already 9 member states that had recognized Palestine. Now we've got 11 EU member states, which means that it's 11 out of 27. Even if we have most likely Slovenia, Belgium, sort of adding on, it will still be a story of division, right? The question of recognition. And then, of course, there's the division over the ICC, the ICJ, what attitude to have towards it. And again, there are divisions within the divisions, yeah? I mean, there are some that have basically sort of taken the US line of, we don't, we don't go for the equivalence between the perpetrators of the crimes, and therefore we don't buy the, sort of putting Israel and Hamas on the same plate. You have those that don't go there, but quite vaguely say, we stand for international law and international, including international tribunals, and those that take a more active sort of position towards the work carried out by the international tribunals. So divisions within the divisions. Now, all this to say that, yes, you are right. Things are shifting. Yeah? I mean, on each one of these questions, we see the way in which gradually over time, there are more member states shifting towards a more critical position towards Israel, be it in terms of embracing a permanent ceasefire, be it in terms of moving towards recognition. However, I don't see this shift as being, quote unquote, fast enough to lead to a unity. And certainly to lead to a unity before, I'm not quite sure, whenever the war will end at this point, but I don't see this happening anytime soon. So if it doesn't happen anytime soon, and it won't happen anytime soon, then I think it's worth reflecting about what the problems of this is. What are rather than the problems, what are the implications that this enduring division, although it shifts balance and changes form, what does it actually lead to? Now, I think one implication has been very clear to anyone in the region is that Europe is simply off the map. Right? Now, in all honesty, Europe was always second fiddle to the United States, but once upon a time, there was only the United States, yeah? The United States, and, this is a segue probably into what Brian will be talking about, but, the United States was the not only the primus inter pares, it was the primus full stop, right, in the region. Now, of course, that's no longer true of the United States. So you have a diminished role of the United States compared to, in relative terms, and not necessarily in absolute terms, right? So a divided EU that keeps on playing second fiddle to a first fiddle, which does not have the standing that it once did. Today, in the region, before you even start talking about Europeans, you've already had the conversation about the United States, about Russia, about China, maybe even about India. And then you're like, oh, okay, right, there's also the Europeans that we should think about, right? So Europeans are kind of, an outcome of the resurfacing of those divisions in these multiple forms has been a kind of, ruling out, basically, of the Europeans. And that's kind of one set of issues, one set of problems. A second, in some respects, more insidious set of problems, which in a sense one can encapsulate in the sort of, the risk of doing harm, right? I mean, it's better to be divided and to do nothing than to be united and to do harm, right? And how is it that harm could come about? The harm could come about when the EU, Europeans, knowing that they are irrelevant or that they run the risk of irrelevance, are so eager, right, to play a role that they end up playing a negative role. And let me just give you a few examples. One which has already come about the maritime operation in the Red Sea. This was very much the product of the EU saying, we've got to do something, yeah? We can't do anything on Gaza, so let's do something. Is it actually the best possible use of our resources at this point in time? Frankly, not. Is it actually going to put a halt to the Houthi attacks in the Red Sea? Actually not. However, the anxiety of wanting to do something meant that they basically, and this was the only thing that they could agree on, they kind of latched onto this opportunity and started doing something. Two, in a sense, far more potentially damaging roles that the Europeans could play have to do firstly with humanitarian assistance, and secondly with the Rafah border. On humanitarian assistance, of course, here the problem of humanitarian access is a land problem, as we know, right? It is the lack of access through land. And it's all very well and good saying, well, we can partly remedy that problem by constructing a pier and ensuring that humanitarian assistance reaches Gaza also through the sea. But we know, and UN agencies have been telling us, sort of left, right, and center, that this is not that this cannot be a substitute. It can only be a complement. Now, if it ends up being a substitute rather than a complement, and of course, we know that humanitarian assistance has a pronounced European role because there's Cyprus into the mix. Obviously the geography is what it is, right? This is not stuff that is shipped from the United States into Gaza. The EU basically and European countries risk, in fact, already are becoming complicit in a problem that it has to do with the lack of humanitarian access, basically, right? So I think that's already one. So the Red Sea thing has happened. This question here is in the making. I mean, it's happening. And then, of course, there's the future that could also happen, which is Europeans stepping in and reactivating their mission, their border mission in Rafah. Again, it is something that could mean very different things. If we're in a magical world in which the PA returns to Gaza and the war ends, and what a wonderful world this would be, then obviously having, Europeans monitoring the Rafah border would be great. But if it's not the case, right, if we're still in a situation of an Israeli reoccupation of Gaza and Europeans play that role, then it's complicity in a very different setup and potentially set of crimes, right? So, I think that second set of challenges has to do with Europeans aware of their divisions, wanting to step in to camouflage those divisions by ending up doing things that are either useless or damaging. And then a very final point, and I realize I've already spoken too long, but a very final point that is a repercussion, and it connects to some of the points that Nimrod was making here in relation to Israel, but I actually think they also apply to Europe, which has to do with the relationship that we have with the rest of the world, and in particular with the so-called Global South. Now, we were never particularly popular, right, in the Global South. However, if one is to be totally, sort of cynical about this, there was a time in which the Global South didn't really matter, right? And so, okay, we may not have been particularly popular. Israel was not particularly popular either, right? But kind of so what, right? I mean, I'm being really brutal about this now. Well, now there is a so what. And the so what sort of Nimrod was explaining what that so what implies as far as Israel is concerned. The so what as far as Europe is concerned is obviously not Middle East related, or not exclusively Middle East related, but it relates to other issues which are very important to Europe too. Take, for instance, Ukraine. And the importance of this is being appreciated by some. I just kind of close in saying, if sort of anyone on the call hasn't done this already, I really invite them to listen to President Zelensky's speech at the Shangri-La dialogue I think it was yesterday or the day before, I can't remember. Yeah, Zelensky taking a very firm stance on the Middle East, right, and on Gaza, and on the two-state solution, and on international law, and on humanitarian assistance. Why? Because, of course, there's a peace conference coming up in Geneva, right, in only a few days' time. And it is very clear that there is a massive risk, basically, of no one, or not no one, but of fewer people showing up than they did at the previous iterations of that conference. So this is hugely consequential because the voice and the views of that rest of the world matter far more today than they did a few years ago. And I'll stop there.
Thank you, Nathalie. All right, Brian. The Biden administration has gone to length to avoid suggesting that Israel has crossed President Biden's red line in its operation in Rafah. But given Europe's strong criticism of Israel, the US is looking more and more isolated on this matter. How would you assess the administration's reaction to the Rafah operation so far?
Great, and thanks for joining the briefing. First, I think America's standing in the world quite clearly has been damaged by the Biden administration's overall response to the Israel-Hamas war, not just this most recent Rafah episode. It's isolated itself in successive votes at the United Nations on the war. There's also the domestic strong criticisms from different voices inside of America, and some of the factors that Nathalie talked about as well, other countries around the world taking different positions from the US position, which prioritized Israel's right of self-defense and aligned itself to the goal of the military defeat of Hamas. So this period of damage, I think comes, I want to highlight this, comes after the end of a 20-year period where the United States repeatedly has had this crisis of efficacy, I call it, or effectiveness, that we've had 4 presidents from George W. Bush to the current president, Joe Biden, state successive things, whether they're various red lines on Syria or now red line on Rafah, or certain goals in the Iraq war, or things like the North Korea regime not getting a nuclear weapon. We've had successive US presidents actually say certain things and then not achieve them. So that's one thing I'd say, is that this has been a damaging period. But despite all of that, the second point I'd make is that America remains, in my view, unrivaled in its ability to shape and influence events around the world and in the Middle East. No doubt what Nathalie said, I fully agree with, that it's not what it used to be. But my point here is that no other country, including China, and despite the summit last week we saw with many of America's Gulf allies, partners going to China in their own pivot to Asia, if you would call it that, not China, not Russia, not Europe, they don't have the depth and breadth of relationships to shape outcomes the way that the United States does today. And I'm saying that even after 20 years of damage, self-inflicted wounds, unforced errors. What I do think would be wise on this issue, on the Israel-Palestine question, as well as other questions, Nathalie suggested this when she was talking about the response to the Houthis in the Red Sea, is that I think this effort to marshal multilateral and then even minilateral efforts together, that America and Europe would do well to actually talk more about that. I know why the upcoming NATO summit will understandably be focused on Ukraine and Russia, but I've been an advocate for actually including some of the issues related to Eastern Mediterranean, North Africa, and then certainly the heart of the Middle East. So bottom line, I know you want to ask me a little bit about Biden's plan that he announced on Friday when he said it was time for the war to end. I see this as mostly a public diplomacy and strategic communications attempt to use tactics to achieve this long sought after ceasefire and hostage release deal. In a sense, it's a do-over to what was attempted earlier in May, when there was that episode where there was confusion about the shifting terms of a deal and Hamas seemingly accepting a deal that Israel said was not on the table. And I think by publicizing some of this, but linking it to a 3-phase plan, which is, to be clear, a plan that I don't think it will certainly outlast a Biden administration, even if he gets a second term. Right, because the third phase of the plan is talking about the reconstruction of Gaza. So this implies a long-term commitment to the Middle East that the U.S., I think, won't be able to fulfill on its own, going back to the point of the need for building partnerships, especially transatlantic partnerships. Last thing I'd say, though you didn't ask about it, I think it's important to highlight also here in America, sitting here, that while America's standing has been damaged by not just the war and the Rafah operation, Biden's political standing at home is also damaged by perception about his handling of the war. A pretty strong majority of American voters disapprove of how he's handled the Middle East in recent metrics. And it's for a variety of different reasons, but I think this reinforces the sense of chaos and disorder that is out there in the world. And the longer this war goes on, it feeds these negative perceptions that truly, I think, began early in the Biden administration with the botched withdrawal from Afghanistan. And that's when Biden's numbers, really his overall numbers, but also perceptions about his handling of foreign policy were damaged, and he went underwater in how he was viewed. But just to close, Zaina, despite these negative perceptions here at home, despite these more isolation in the world, I just highlight again that I think America has no rival when it comes to being an outside force to shape events. It's much diminished, as Nathalie said, and it would be better to partner and partner with European allies. Hope we can talk also more about the more assertive nature of some of the Arab Gulf countries that want to seemingly do more in phase 2 and 3 of Biden's plan. But the simple roadblock here, as we all know, is the current Israeli government, which itself is deeply divided and unclear about whether they'll accept this plan.
All right, thank you, Brian. At this time, I'd like to open up the discussions to callers on the line. To ask a question, please use the raise hand function in Zoom. Keep your hand raised until I call on you and unmute you. Then kindly state your name, affiliation, and direct your question to our panelists. Questions can also be submitted in writing via the Q&A chat box on Zoom. To start things off, I'll pose a question to Nimrod. President Biden is trying to advance a framework deal, which Brian just mentioned, that would wind down the war in Gaza. How has it been received within Israel and within Netanyahu's coalition?
The Israeli public is moving, and currently you have a majority within the Israeli society that is supporting ending the war for the release of all the hostages. So the main concern within the society is the fate of the Israeli hostages. Just yesterday we heard of 5 more people considered hostage being dead, and the sense is the time is running out. There is a sense of urgency, and Netanyahu does not succeed in bringing back them home, which was one of the war objectives when Israel launched this offensive on October 7th and 8th after the Hamas attack. So there is a sense that anything that brings them home is now supported. That wasn't the case exactly like that, like several months ago, because at the time Israel still believed that achieving the other war objectives under the leadership of Netanyahu is feasible. Now the lack of belief in the ability of the prime minister and his coalition to actually deliver has been totally diminished. The sense is of some collapse. Look at what's happening in the north with Hezbollah. Look at the fires. Now the Golan, the Galil is now burning, literally burning because of fires out of rockets. In the south, nothing is happening. Israeli hostages, we see what's going on. Domestic social cohesion is disappearing. So the prices that Israel is paying, not because of international standing, that's not the key consideration for most Israelis, is that this is not going on a positive path. And then when President Biden comes up, not only with a plan to end the war, but with a bigger picture idea of getting a ceasefire in Gaza in order to diffuse tensions between Israel and Hezbollah, in order to pave the way for normalization with the Saudis, that's a much bigger package. Now, we see a different dynamics now with this Biden idea that is supposedly an Israeli one, that is different from how Netanyahu blocked previous ideas that were on the table. Because Netanyahu was very consistent in saying one thing and then doing the other. But now the dynamic since Friday is that he's courting the support of key actors within his coalition. Again, not the far right. The far right ministers have not even seen the plan. He's not showing Ben Gvir the plan, and Ben Gvir is criticizing him. Getting the ultra-Orthodox on board, getting AIPAC on board, seeing AIPAC produce a supportive statement, that really means that Netanyahu has an interest to portray a very positive attitude toward that. Is he genuine? Will he go all the way? Well, now the assumption is that we are waiting for Hamas, and I think the Americans are saying that as well. They are pushing for a Security Council, resolution pushing on Hamas to respond favorably. They are calling leaders in the region for them to push Hamas. So if there is a positive answer from Hamas, what will Netanyahu do? That's money time. It relates to domestic politics, as with everything that Netanyahu does, and a major question of whether Netanyahu wants early elections or not, because his coalition will not stick in his current format if he goes for a deal. Benny Gantz and his centrist party are already on the way out. Ben Gvir and Smotrich are threatening to do that. Does Netanyahu want to take control of the political process to define a time that he likes for an election, possibly in November, just after the American president is being elected? Maybe that's what he's heading to. And if he's going there, being the one that is releasing some hostages, maybe for the sake of then going out of the deal between phase 1 and 2, maybe that's a strategy that we are seeing these days.
Just to build on what you were saying, Nimrod, if the Israeli public does not believe that Netanyahu can achieve the goals of this war, what explains his favorability going up in the polls versus Benny Gantz's favorability, which is decreasing, really?
Yeah. So first, still Netanyahu is down. So his coalition is far from having a majority, according to the polls, to rebuilding itself after an election. I think there is skepticism about the leadership of Benny Gantz. So Benny Gantz, former chief of staff, really was the winner in terms of public attitudes of what happened on October 7th. His party acted responsibly. They joined the coalition, although they are very much opposed to Netanyahu. Him and former IDF chief of staff Gadi Eisenkot are considered leaders with a strong security background that are seeing the national good in front of their eyes, not political survival perhaps like Netanyahu. So they became very favorable. But they didn't capture the changing sentiment of the Israeli public, because the Israeli public is moving to the right in light of the war, not to the far right, not to Ben Gvir and Smotrich, but definitely to the right, not believing there are chances for peace, not believing the two-state solution is feasible, fearing for the security, looking for a sense of security. Tens of thousands of people wanted to go back to their homes in the north, in the south. All of that is happening. And Benny Gantz doesn't have, I think, the leadership traits in terms of how the public sees him to be that guy. So it was kind of a midterm thing. And the new right-wing force that will become quite significant in the upcoming elections has not been established yet. So if it's a Gantz versus Netanyahu thing, Netanyahu captures some of that sentiment of right-wing attitudes, disappointment from Gantz. But once there is this new right-wing party, I think things will shift again. And that's perhaps one of the reasons why Netanyahu, despite the unfavorable polls that he's seeing, may want to go to elections before his rivals are consolidating new political mechanisms that will challenge him very forcefully.
All right, we have a question from the audience. Given the lack of cohesion within Israel, EU, and US, is it not within Hamas's interest to just keep the war going? And given the upcoming elections in the UK and the US, does it also not play into Hamas's interest to keep the war going? Nathalie, do you want to answer this question?
Yeah. So I think that if the choice is between having the war go on and having a post-war Gaza in which Hamas has no role whatsoever, then obviously I'm assuming, I mean, I don't know, right? But I assume that indeed the preference for Hamas would be for the war to go on. And so, you know, I think in these kind of situations, one has to really think through, you know, what the incentive set is here, right? So Hamas will choose for the war to go on if the alternative is being destroyed, being eradicated, being totally, you know, swept out, being whatever, right? In a fairly, yeah, I mean, sort of, well, I don't know, but I can imagine. Now, if that is not necessarily what a post-war Gaza looks like, then I wouldn't say that it's as obvious, right? That Hamas would rather have the war go on rather than anything else, yeah? I mean, it really depends on what the alternative is. If one is to sort of, though, look at it from that broader perspective, bringing in indeed the divisions that we've been talking about, I think it is fair to argue perhaps less relevant to Hamas itself, because, at the end of the day, it's not as if they haven't been taking a beating out of the last 8 months. They have. But if you think about Hamas's backers, if you think about Iran, then I think you can make a stronger argument. Yeah, I mean, I think that if you are sitting in Tehran, then you actually think that the way in which this war has been unfolding, that so far has contained a major regional war. It has exposed the divisions and the hypocrisy and of Iran's adversaries, beginning with the United States, but also the US's allies. It has delegitimized its, enemy Israel. So I think I think there's a stronger argument that can be made about the war as is being in Iran's interest. In the case of Hamas, I think you can make that argument, but it depends on what the alternative sort of Gaza scenario is.
All right. Brian, building on what we've talked about earlier, what will it take for President Biden's plan to work, and what do you see as some of the challenges it faces?
It'll take a lot of time, number one, because if you look at the 3 phases and just evaluate what needs to happen, and in particular, phase 1 is basically the attempt to get this temporary ceasefire, hostage release, and prisoner deal executed. But phase 2 begins, according to what the White House issued, with Israel withdrawing its forces from Gaza. If you look at the statements from Israeli leaders, and this is across the spectrum, it's probably quite some time. Again, if Donald Trump is reelected, it goes into his administration. So then that means the plan is scuttled. It seems quite likely, that Israeli forces will be. So time is one factor. 2, I'm of the view that it's going to take more concerted U.S. engagement, and better that we do it with a team or a posse from the region, as well as Europe, because it's a complicated plan. Just the ideas that have been floated and discussed that are out there right now, a plan that helps Israel feel secure, but also helps Gazans feel secure after this devastating war, that starts with Israeli forces at some point withdrawing, but then being replaced in some sort of way. The current discussion is on a multinational force with participation from the region. When you get into the details of how you do that, particularly if Hamas is not disarmed, and if there are other forces like Islamic Jihad, that complicates the security landscape. It's a very long-term effort. So there's time, additional resources. I would say stepped up U.S. engagement. Again, and a lot of people in America don't share this view, because some have said the U.S. is doing too much in the Middle East. But if there is a general agreement about the necessity for a 2-state solution and the creation of a state of Palestine, this is a long-term effort that requires the sort of coalition that we've not yet seen organized in the region or around the world. And I raise this point quite frequently, including on a recent trip to the region. If you remember, during the ISIS crisis, Daesh and its rise, there was the creation of an international coalition that first Barack Obama and then Donald Trump used as a mechanism to at least militarily defeat, if not defeat, the idea of ISIS. We don't have a similarly coordinated effort. We have a bunch of piecemeal efforts, visits here and there. It's, we mentioned earlier, and Nathalie mentioned also, these recognitions of a state of Palestine that are symbolic, but actually don't do much for the actual people on the ground. So those are time resources and coordinated resources at a high level. I think also quite likely a change, and Nimrod can comment on this, quite likely a change in the Israeli government for this plan to be achieved, because you have certain ministers in the Israeli government that just oppose and have threatened that if Netanyahu goes with this plan, that they will collapse his government or they will leave. So the big challenges are the spoilers. Number one, Hamas. Hamas has rejected multiple offers and different deals, and I think there's a certain interest. All a lot of the rumors and intel reports about Yahya Sinwar is that he's feeling elated, that every time he sees sort of more protests on U.S. college campuses and dissent inside of America and in Europe, they feel like they've got Israel on the ropes. So spoilers like Hamas, spoilers in the Israeli government, and then Iran and the axis of resistance has demonstrated time and time again that they're not only advancing efforts on a daily basis to make Israel feel less secure. We see this in the north of Israel, but they're also advancing a powerful narrative that has some appeal across the region, and as we see in certain quarters here in the United States and Europe. And that's the thing I'd close on, is that part of this is an actual physical war. Part of this is a very much political narrative war. And the Biden team, I think, on Friday afternoon, very briefly sent the president out there to say, look, there's a plan here, light at the end of the tunnel. It will take a lot of heavy lifting for this to succeed, and for them to do that 5 months before the US elections on their own, I think will be hard. That's why it's important to have partners in the region, partners in Europe, where we're working together on that.
I have a question for Nimrod from one of the attendees. Has Israel ever changed its government during a war in its history? And does having an election now or soon with potential social media manipulation from bad state actors make sense?
First, I will say that elections definitely make sense. The level of failure by the leadership of Israel was so immense, and that's why a vast majority of Israelis, for all political walks of life, want to go to the polls, want to elect a new leadership. So that's what the public wants, and that's what reality, I think, leads, and I think people get it, and it's only a matter of time. And of course, there's a lot of political manipulation around that, and elections will be ugly, and they will always be ugly, and that's given. But we need to do that. To be a democracy is also to go to elections at difficult times. In terms of history, I think what we see now is a different sort of war coming, because after Israel concludes its operation in Gaza, in Rafah, which will take maybe a few more weeks, basically the high intensity phase is over. There's nothing else, nowhere else to go. There will be all kind of occasional in and outs from different parts of the Gaza Strip. We'll see that continuing, much like it's happening on the West Bank. But in terms of internal domestic calculations of what does it mean for daily life in Israel, Israel could handle its domestic politics at a time of low intensity presence and operation within the Gaza Strip. What we should take into account is Lebanon, because we're talking a lot about Gaza. But the real big threat now, I think, is what happens on the Israel-Lebanon border, because the escalation over there, we saw Israel and Hezbollah escalating for months, but really stopping beyond a full-fledged war. But it's reaching a situation, if Gaza quiets down a bit in terms of what Israel needs to invest, the challenge of the Israeli leadership is, does it provide protection and security to its citizens who are living in the northern half of the country? And that may be a big decision to make. And that may change calculations on election time. Because if Israel enters a wartime period with Hezbollah, that will not be a time in which elections will be possible. But take into account that at least 100 days from when the Knesset decides to dissolve and go to the polls until election takes place. And there are recesses for the summer, and there are Jewish holidays in October. So any scenario, we are talking about elections not before late fall, winter, spring 25. So it's a long-term process. And by the way, just the point of the multilateralism issue that was mentioned before, we have the UN General Assembly coming up in September. If there is an intention for some multilateral event that we heard the Europeans speak about at the Territory Peace Conference and other ideas, over the last 2 years, there were events on the sidelines of the UNGA to try and advance something related to Israel-Palestine, where the Saudis convened a meeting 2 years ago on reviving the Arab Peace Initiative. Nothing really happened with that. Last year, we saw Borrell, the European, convening a multilateral event on incentive for peace. Nothing really happened on that. So if there is an attempt for a multilateral event on Israel-Palestine in September in New York, I think we should make sure that it's really meaningful and not another photo op or convention just to tick a box.
Nathalie, just a quick, if you could go a little deeper into something you've touched on earlier in your remarks, how does the European response to the Gaza war affect other critical security issues in Europe?
Well, the main repercussion is on Ukraine. And you know, I think we only need to look at the two snapshots of, you know, the votes on Ukraine at the UN General Assembly and the votes on Gaza to really kind of see how there's been a total flip, basically. You know, on Ukraine, the story was the world majority is with us. Okay, there's a very significant minority that is not part of it, yeah? However, it is the global dimensions of Ukraine before Gaza was not although Russia tried to portray it this way, but it was not a global north, global south division. It was, if anything, a global west, global east division with a massive global south that may not have been prepared to, quote unquote, pay a price in defense of international law, but it firmly stood behind international law, right? So that was, in a sense, okay, the fact that they were not prepared to price kind of got us thinking, and it got us trying to develop ways of finding new forms of engagement with many of these countries. But as I said, we started from a pretty strong position, right? Now that position has been totally wiped off. Yeah, I mean, Gaza has dramatically changed the perception, actually, I think, even more of Europe than of the United States. And this is, I think, an interesting one, because the question, if you think of it, you know, sort of the question of the Palestine question is, in many respects, the global repercussions of it are, or should be, far more limited compared to Ukraine, right? I mean, Ukraine touches on food security, it touches on energy, it touches on nuclear. I mean, it touches on these big things that are consequential for everyone in the world. I mean, Gaza, in all honesty, does not. However, Gaza is felt in a way in which Ukraine is not, because it symbolizes the injustice, which is not limited to the Middle East, but it's connected to a number of other things, many of which have their root in Europe, right? Far more than in the United States. And so it reawakens the old, you know, sort of the sentiments that have been for, you know, decades, in fact, for centuries, about, you know, colonialism and all the rest of it. And those sentiments have always been there. But the point and the reason why they're so consequential now is that they have been reawakened in a world that is fundamentally different. You know, earlier, in a sort of rather cynical way, I say, and I'll repeat it again, there was a time in which one could say, well, you know what, so what, right? You know, we are the only game in town, and they may not like us, but they don't have an alternative. Now these countries have alternatives. And so if you put you know, at the same time, this kind of, you know, convergence of your normative standing that was already low and has kind of plummeted with a situation which is substantively one in which you don't have as much to offer, your instruments are not as effective as they once were, you have other competitors on the scene. Well, you know, you put these two things together, and they're obviously very consequential in the immediate security crisis Ukraine today. But more broadly, they're consequential because if you want to get things done, and this connects to some of the points that Brian was making as well, as far as the US is concerned, you need to work with others far more than in the past, right? So it matters if those others don't want to work with you and they think that you are weak and divided and totally immoral and all the rest of it. So I think it's consequential not just for the security crises that exist today, i.e. Ukraine, but for the crises that will erupt in future because of this fundamental change in the world that we live in.
All right, which brings me to my final question to Brian. The Rafah operation has led to rising tensions with Israel's neighbors, most notably Egypt. What's at stake here?
What's at stake is the entire framework that was built in the late 1970s and early 80s for U.S. engagement in the Middle East. I don't think it's at a high risk of it collapsing. If you see this incident that happened last week when an Egyptian soldier was killed, it was quickly sort of downplayed, in my view, by the Egyptian government. And though there were real high concerns raised at the beginning of this operation, as Nimrod was saying, I think at the outset of this briefing, is that so far, and there's ongoing talks, and I don't believe they've produced much yet, on who will control the Rafah border crossing that started this weekend in Cairo. The fact that those talks continue, the fact that there's mutual self-interests in trying to manage this so it doesn't get out of control. The framework, I think, is still there and it's strong. I think any post-war scenario, and I've been part of different discussions that talk about what comes next after this awful conflict is over, we'll necessarily have to lean on that framework and update the framework that was established for Israel-Egypt relations, but then necessarily, going back all the way to the Camp David Accords, the annex that was unfulfilled, the idea and the notion of the creation of a state of Palestine as an important piece in the puzzle. So right now, things are a bit under stress and shaky, but I think they continue. The security bureaus and departments continue to talk closely with each other, and there's a self-interest to contain a lot of the threats that come from different extremist and terrorist organizations that operate not just in Gaza, but in the Sinai Peninsula. But again, it's straining and stressing this, and I think it'll be interesting to watch how this unfolds. I mean, clearly, the Rafah operation has been an important one from an Israeli military standpoint, in part because of the tunnels and the network of tunnels. And I think one question to ask or to watch is, as it unfolds, what evidence emerges about possible cooperation or complicity of some parts of the Egyptian state security services in some of the tunnel efforts and everything that got into Gaza over the last 15 years. It's also, and I'll close on this, an issue for Israel as well. And it has yet to have its own reckoning about the political reckoning about the responsibility for October 7th and this whole arrangement, this Faustian bargain with Hamas that Netanyahu and other Israeli leaders themselves are complicit in. Israel clearly was not objectively made much safer by that. So this operation, I think, will stress this, and strain things, but I don't think it'll break.
One more question for you from the audience, Brian. If Trump wins the election, will Bibi survive, and will the U.S. survive?
It's an interesting question. I think first, there's a lot of uncertainty if President Trump is reelected about his own agenda. It's unclear who would be his closest advisors or how he would position. I think the question of whether Bibi survives, and maybe Nimrod or Nathalie will agree or disagree with this, but I think it's more related to intra-Israeli politics. Bibi, as a leader himself, has damaged the trust and confidence that he's had with many previous coalition partners. And the current government that he's in, it seems like he's in a pretty weakened position, which is why I think this speech that the Democrats and Republicans have invited him to give in Congress comes at a very, very interesting moment in not only U.S.-Israel relations, but the key point here is that I think what matters more is how Netanyahu relates to some of the other Israeli leaders and where the political spectrum in his own system goes. Trump, of course, will impact that. I think Trump will likely be less predictable than Biden has been on these issues. And, the key variable, again, is internal Israeli politics, which I think is in uncharted territory.
All right. Thank you, everyone, for your questions. It looks like we're going to have to wrap things up now. But if you have any more questions, please email them to me at zalshaib@mei.edu. I would be happy to send them to our panelists who will try and answer them at a later time. I hope you will join me in thanking Nathalie Tocci, Nimrod Goren, and Brian Katulis for participating in this week's session on Israel's global standing amid the Rafah offensive. We really appreciate your insight and your willingness to share your morning with us. If you find these calls valuable and want to learn more about other resources MEI can provide, do not hesitate to reach out to us. We would be more than happy to connect. I wish you all the best and hope you have a great rest of your day.